Hello, and happy Independence Day from me, Tad. And there's America's ass right there hanging on the door. So as you can see, we are firmly in the 4th of July spirit. I looked through my clothing to see if I had any appropriate red, white, and blue. And all the red, white, and blue t-shirts that I had, at least the ones that prominently featured red, white, and blue, were in fact all with the stars and stripes, not the stars and stripes, the British flag. Sorry, the Union Jack, which didn't seem entirely appropriate for the 4th of July, so I made do with the next best in terms of something that did have red, white, and blue, albeit a few other colors tossed in there as well, most notably yellow and green. But that's okay. The general feeling is still clear. This is the 4th of July. This is Independence Day. And for those of the listeners tonight who are Americans, we are celebrating Independence Day. So thank you for joining me whenever you may happen to be hearing this. I am pre-recording it because I can't do a live reading tonight because we are actually doing a family thing, which we didn't get to do last year and which is important part of the summer for us, is getting the family together on the 4th of July. So I'm going to read. Before I do, was there anything I wanted to talk about? I started to a little bit last night to a predominantly European audience. I was talking about my ambivalent but loving feelings for my country. Ambivalent because I grew up not agreeing with a great deal of what America was doing, both on the world stage and domestically as well. And it wasn't until I moved to England in the 1990s that I began to understand how exactly I was American. Because again, as I said, a lot of my early life, it was kind of, I saw myself as being in opposition to a lot of things that were considered to be traditionally American or that defined Americanism. And, this was the era of the Vietnam War, the end of the civil rights movement, moving into the age of assassinations, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, the free speech movement, the anti-war protests, all of this stuff. And of course, there have been many times in the last years when I have not felt particularly great about what my country was doing. But that being said, and especially after my sojourn living in England and traveling a lot in other parts of the world, I've come to realize that I am rather ineluctably American in many, many ways, and that I do love my country. And one of the reasons that I love America is, to this point, as of now, still, you're allowed to say what you don't like. You are allowed to say, I disagree with this. I think this is a bad idea. I do not like this being done in my name. And there's a lot of places in the world where you cannot do that. And those are not places I would want to live. So the good, the bad, everything all together, that's what we have. That's what my country is. And there is still a lot of good in it. And we also have a tradition of wanting to better ourselves, not just as individuals, but as a country. We hold ourselves to a high standard. And in opposition to what some people would say, I don't think we've oftentimes met that high standard. But most of us want to do better. And most of us want to be what we often claim to be, which is the shining city on the hill, the paradise of democracy. I don't think we're there. I don't think we're there or anywhere near it. But I think at least there is the chance to get better. And I think a lot of the things that have happened in the last few years have been things that will push us in that direction. And as I said, everybody is entitled to say what they don't like and what they do like. And that is one thing that we should never let go of, because freedom of speech and freedom of expression are probably democracy's most powerful and most important weapons. And democracy needs its weapons these days because there are a lot of people who don't understand what it would be like to live in something other than a democracy. And it doesn't matter whether you call it a republic or a democracy or whatever. What we're talking about is where people get to vote and where people's votes are actually worth what they're supposed to be worth, and where when people are criminal bastards, we can chuck them out if enough of us agree to do so, and that if people try to take our rights away, we can have arguments about what should happen and whether we should do that or we should go another way. So, like a lot of people who live in democratic, whatever you'd want to call them, economically fairly secure countries, I don't want to throw it all away. I don't trust massive upheavals because I think they tend to affect badly the people who can least afford to weather them. So I'm not a revolutionary, but I think there are some things that we need to get revolutionary about in our country, and the most important being that we are a nation of people from all cultures, all religions, all parts of the world. And I should mention religion includes not having a religion as well. And we need to protect those things. We need to protect people's voices. We need to not make a level playing field necessarily, because I don't think that's possible without massive intervention and a kind of nanny state. But on the other hand, we do need to recognize that we have been terrible about hearing other people's voices, about hearing things that were not part of the white wealthy mainstream, part of the male straight mainstream. And the fact that some of these things are getting pushed back now, that's not cancel culture, folks. Cancel culture is another one of those BS terms like political correctness that are meant to say, basically, we don't like it that we can't just openly insult people anymore. And in fact, because we live in a largely mediated world, if somebody insults me or insults my kind of person, I don't have that option anymore of walking over and punching them in the nose because they may be somewhere very far away. Not that I'm in favor of punching people in the nose, but one of the things about social media is that it does remove people from many kinds of consequences, and not simply the physical consequence of somebody beating you up. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that we can spout any kind of opinion now and not actually have to deal with the audience, not see people reacting, not see people looking shocked or angry or shuffling uncomfortably as we say something stupid or unpleasant to somebody else. And because we live in this more mediated society, I think we have to be even more careful about not bullying. And bullying is my number one dislike in all the world. The power and the powerful punching down at the less powerful is something that I absolutely loathe. And fortunately, that is a component of what America believes in. The question of who is being punched down on, obviously a subject still under discussion, because a lot of people who, to me, are part of the power structure seem to feel it's terribly unfair for people to say anything negative to them, even about the power structure itself and the terrible things it's done. I don't believe that. I believe all voices are important. I believe all voices should be heard, and I believe we should be striving at all times to make a country that celebrates what makes it as good as it has been, and that has been, in large part, bringing in people of many different types and allowing them to take part in it and allowing them to contribute and paying attention to them when they contribute and learning from them, not simply forcing them to be like us, because our version of like us is a very old model where we're basically asking people to be like we thought people should be 70 years ago. No, the world of the future is not going to be like that. So we need to encourage and enjoy and absorb and accept and utilize all the different viewpoints and all the different strengths that we have in this country and that can come to us from other parts of the world. Anyway, there's my editorial, absolutely off the cuff and unplanned, probably largely incoherent, but that's okay too, because it's the 4th of July, and bloviating political speeches are also part of our national heritage on this day. Okay, so what I'm going to do at this point is I am going to continue reading what I was reading, which is from Shadowmarch. And last night we read several sections. Mostly, the most important bit was Barrick revealing to Bryony that he's had nightmares all of his life, that he had a terrible experience with their father, who in the middle of the night when Barrick was young, he came to find him, and his father was basically crazy, and assaulted him and threw him down the stairs, and that's what happened to his crippled arm. And that also that this is his father had told him later on that this was a kind of madness, and that Beric was probably going to inherit it too. So that was the first thing that came up last night's reading. The other thing that came up in last night's reading that is significant is that Ferris Vanson and his group of soldiers and a young woman named Willow, who was a local, who had been swallowed up like they had by the Shadow Line, finally found their way back to the real world again. But with the twin deficits, the twin negatives, that on the one hand that one of their party, Colum Dyer, had been snatched by some horrible thing before they got out from behind the Shadow Line, and that now they are between the Fairy Army, the Twilight People's Army, and Southmarch, so they must hurry to Southmarch to warn them about what's happening. Then the last bit we were reading, which now I'm going to start with, was Quiniton down in Zis, who was being taken out of that part of the seclusion, as it's called, the harem, by her friend Luyan, one of the favored, and then has been directed to go get something for Luyan out of a dark doorway, and Quiniton has suddenly figured out that there's something wrong here, that there's no reason they should have come this far, and there's no reason that Luyan would have had that thing in the first place that she's sending Quiniton to fetch. Anyway, so that's where I'm going to start again, is going back a few paragraphs in this. As she approached the dark doorway, she could not help slowing her footsteps, listening for the breath of a hidden assassin behind the hedges. But why would Luyan resort to something so crude? Unless it was the autarch himself who had decided it had all been a mistake, that Quiniton was not the one he wanted. Perhaps the mute giant Mokor, his infamous chief strangler, was waiting for her inside the doorway. Or perhaps she wasn't important enough and her death would be affected instead by someone like the so-called gardener Tenisa. Quiniton looked back, but Luyan was looking in another direction entirely, talking rapidly and a little too loudly with her slaves. Her nerves now stretched tight as lute strings. Quiniton let out a muffled shriek when the man stepped from the shadows. "Quiet! I believe you are looking for this," he said, holding out a shawl woven of fine silk. "Do not forget it when you go out again." "Jedin!" She threw her hand over her mouth. "What are you doing here?" A whole man in the seclusion. What would happen to him if they were caught? What would happen to her? The leopard captain quickly and easily moved between her and the door, cutting off her escape. She looked frantically around the small, dark room. There was nothing much in it but a low table and some cushions, and no other way out. "I wish to see you. I wish to speak with you." Jedin stepped up and caught her hand in his wide fingers, pulled her deeper into the room. Her heart was beating so quickly she could scarcely take a breath, but she could not entirely ignore the strength of his grip or the way it made her feel. If he wished, he could throw her over one of his broad shoulders and carry her away, and there would be nothing she could do. Except scream, of course, but who could guess what she would earn for herself if she did? "Come, I will not keep you long," he said. "I have put my life in your hands by coming here, mistress. Surely you will not begrudge me a few moments." He was looking at her so searchingly, so intently, that she found she could not meet his eye. She felt hot and feverish again. Could this all be some mad dream? Could the priest's elixir have driven her mad? Still, Jedin looked disturbingly solid, huge and handsome as a temple carving. "What do you want with me?" "What I cannot have, I know." He let go of her hand, made his own into a fist. I cannot stop thinking of you, Quiniton. My heart will not rest. You haunt my dreams even. I drop things, forget things." She shook her head, really frightened now. No, that is..." She took a step toward him and then thought better of it. His arms had risen as if to pull her toward him, and she knew that more than his strength, would make it hard to break away again. This is all madness, Jedin. Captain. Even if we forget why I am here in the seclusion, who has brought me here? She froze at a noise from outside, but it was just two of the youngest wives shrieking with laughter as they played some game. Even if we forget that you scarcely know me, you have seen me twice. No, mistress. No, I saw you every day that I was a child, and you were a child. When we were children together, you were the only one who was kind to me. The look on his face was so serious that it would have been comical if she had not been in terror for her life. I know it is wrong, but I cannot bear to think that you are for him. She shook her head at this blasphemy, wanting only to be far away. There was something about the young leopard chieftain that made her heart ache, made her want to comfort him. And there was no question she felt something for him that went beyond that, but she could not push away her growing fright. Each moment that passed, she felt more like the quarry of some ruthless hunting pack. All that will happen is that we will both be killed. Whatever you think, Jedin, you scarcely know me. Call me Jin, as you once did. No, we were just children. You followed my brothers. They were cruel to you, perhaps, but I was no better. I was a girl, a shy girl. I said nothing to any of my brother's friends to stop them. You were kind. You liked me. She let out a murmured groan of frustration and anguish. Jedin, you must go away and never do this again. Do you love him? Who? You mean the... She moved closer, so close she could feel his breath on her face. She put a hand on his broad chest to keep him from trying to embrace her. Of course I don't, she said quietly. I am nothing to our master, less than nothing. A chair, a rug, a bowl in which to clean his hands. But I would not steal a washing bowl from him, and neither would you. If you try to steal me, we'll both be killed. She took a breath. I do care for you, Jedin, at least a little. The anxious lines on his forehead disappeared. Then there is hope. There is reason to live. Quiet! You did not hear me out. I care for you, and in another life, perhaps it could be more, but I don't wish to die for any man. Do you understand? Go away. Never even think of me again. She tried to pull away, but he caught her now in a grip she could not have broken in 1,000 years. Let go, she whispered, looking in panic toward the doorway. They will be wondering where I've gone. Luyan will distract them a while longer. He leaned forward until she almost whimpered from the size and closeness of him. You do not love him. Let me go. Shh! I am not long for this place. My enemies want to throw me down. Enemies? I am a peasant who became chieftain of the Autarch's own guards. The paramount minister, Vash, hates me. I amuse the Golden One. He calls me his rough watchdog and laughs when I use the wrong words. But Penimin, Vash, and the others wish to see my head on a spike. I could kill any one of them with my bare hands, but in this palace it is the gazelles that rule, not the leopards. Then why are you giving them this chance to destroy you? This is beyond foolishness. You'll murder us both. No, I will think of something. We will be together. His eyes went distant, and Quiniton's speeding heart bumped and seemed to miss a beat. In that moment he looked nearly as mad as the Autarch. We will be together, he said again. She took advantage of his distraction and yanked her wrist free, then backed hurriedly toward the doorway. Go away, Jedin! Don't be a fool! His eyes were suddenly shiny with tears. Stop, he said. Don't forget. He threw her the rose-colored shawl. I will come to you one night. Quiniton almost choked. You will do no such thing. She turned and hurried out the door, back into the heavy air of the scented garden. Are you mad too? She whispered to Luyan as she handed her the shawl. A few of the other wives were watching her, but with what she prayed was no more than a bored interest in the comings and goings of a fellow prisoner. We will all be executed, tortured. Luyan did not look at her, but her face was mottled with red underneath the heavy face paint. You do not understand. Understand? What is there to understand? I am only one of the favored. He is the chief of the Autox leopards. He could have me arrested and killed on almost any pretext he chose. Who would believe the word of a fat castrate in women's clothes over the master of the Golden One's muskets? Jedin wouldn't do such a thing. He would indeed. He said so. He told me he would. Quinniton was shocked. He thinks he is in love, she said at last. People do mad things when they feel that way. Yes. Luyan faced her now, and there were tears in the favored's long-lashed eyes. One had made a track down the powder of her cheek. Yes, you silly little girl. They do. Chapter 25. Mirrors, Missing and Found. The Weeping of Ancient Women. Grey as the egrets of the hither shore, lost as a wind from the old dark land, frightened, yet fierce. From the Bonefall Oracles. Chert had already sat down on the bench to rest his tired legs when he realized Opal had not followed him in, but was still standing in the doorway, peering out into Wedge Road. What is it, my dear? Flint? He's not with you? He frowned. Why would he be with me? I left him home with you because he's such a distraction where we're working right now. Won't stay with me because he doesn't like it there, but won't stay where I tell him above ground either. He felt a clutch in his chest. You mean he's gone? I don't know. Yes, he went with me to Lower Orr Street. Then when I came back, he was playing beside the road, piling up stones and making those walls and tunnels and whatnot he likes so much. The dust that comes in on that boy. Tears filled her eyes. Oh, and I don't know. I went out to call him in to eat hours ago, and he was gone. I've been up and down the roads, down to the guild hall. I even went to the salt pool and asked little Boulder if he'd been there. Nobody's seen him at all. He got himself up, despite his aching legs, and hurried to put his arms around her. There, my old darling, there. I'm sure he's just up to some pranks. He is a boy, after all, and a very independent lad at that, the Earth Elders know. He'll be back before our evening meal is over, you'll see. Evening meal? She almost shrieked. You old fool, do you think I've had time to prepare an evening meal? I've been hurrying all around town the length of the afternoon with my heart aching, trying to find that boy. There is no evening meal. Sobbing out loud now, she turned and stumbled back toward their bed and wrapped herself in a blanket, so that all he could see was a shuddering lump. Chert was troubled, too, but he couldn't help feeling that Opal was getting a bit ahead of things. Flint would not be the first boy in Thunderling Town, or the last, to wander off on some childish quest and lose track of time. It had only been a short while ago he had disappeared during the Prince Regent's funeral. If he wasn't back by bedtime, they could start fretting in earnest. In the meantime, though, Chert had put in a long day, and his stomach felt shrunken and empty as a dried leather sack. He half-heartedly examined the larder. Oh, look, we have grapefruits in, he said loud enough for Opal to hear. A bit of cooking and those would go down a treat. She didn't answer. He picked through the other roots and various tubers. Some were looking a bit whiskery. Perhaps I'll just have a bit of bread and some cheese. There isn't any bread. The lump under the blanket shifted. It did not sound like a happy lump. I was going to go back out and get the afternoon's baking, but... Yes, of course, Chert said hurriedly. Never fear. Still, it's a shame about the great roots. A bit of cooking. If you want them cooked, cook them yourself, if you know how. Chert was sadly chewing a piece of raw grapefruit. He had not realized how much more bitter they tasted if they had not been boiled in beet sugar, and beginning to admit to himself that the boy was not coming back for his evening meal. Not that a raw root and a piece of hard cheese was particularly worth coming back for, but Chert couldn't deny that the pang of disquiet was growing inside him. Although his mug of ale had helped to wash down the fibrous root and remove a little of the worst of the throbbing of his legs and back, it had not gone very far toward soothing his mind. He had been out into Wedge Road several times. The dimmer stone lights were lit for evening, and the streets were nearly empty as families finished their suppers and prepared for the night. The children must be all in bed by now. The other children. He decided to take a lamp and go out looking. Could the boy have gone into one of the unfinished tunnels, he wondered, been caught by a slide in one of the side corridors where the bracing was less than adequate? But what would he be doing in such a place? Chert let his mind run across other possibilities, some happier and others much more frightening. Could he have gone home with another child? Flint was so unworldly in some ways that Chert could easily imagine he would forget to send word of where he was, let alone ask permission. But he had never really made friends with any of the Funderling children, even those in nearby houses who were of his own age. Where else? Down in the excavations where Chert had been working, near the Eden family tomb? Certainly there were treacherous spots there, but Flint had made it clear he hated the place. And in any case, how could Chert have missed him? The roof-toppers, the little people. Perhaps the boy had gone to see them and either stayed or not been able to get back before dark. Unbidden, a horrid vision came to him of the boy fallen from a roof and lying helpless in some shadowy, unvisited courtyard. He put the grapefruit down, sickened. But where else could he be? "Chert!" Opal shouted from the bedchamber. "Chert, come here!" He wished she did not sound frightened. Suddenly he didn't want to walk through the door and see what she had found. But he did. Opal had not found anything. In fact, rather the reverse. "It's gone," she said, pointing at the boy's pallet, at the blanket and shirt lying across it in twisted coils like weary ghosts. "His bag, with that little mirror in it. It's gone." Opal turned to him, eyes big with fear. "He never puts it on anymore, never wears it. It's always here. Why isn't it here now?" Her face suddenly grew slack, as though she had aged 5 years in a matter of moments. "He's gone away, hasn't he? He's gone away for good, and so he took it with him." Chert could think of nothing to say, or in any case, nothing that would make either of them feel better. "By the gods, Toby, are you falling asleep again? You've jogged the glass." The young man stood up quickly, raising his hands in the air to show that he couldn't possibly have done such a thing. His look of wounded honor suggested that he was always awake and at his best in the midnight hours, and that Chavin was being needlessly cruel to suggest otherwise. "But, Master Chavin—" "Never mind. I expect you to be a man of science, and I suppose that is asking too much." "But I want to be. I listen. I do everything you say." The physician sighed. It was not really the lad's fault. Chavin had put too much stock in the recommendation of his friend, Ewan Dogsend, who was the most learned man in Blueshore, but perhaps not its best judge of character. The young man worked hard, for his age, but he was distracted and touchy at the best of times, and worst of all, although he was by no means stupid, he seemed to have an unquestioning pattern of mind. "It's like trying to make my dear Mistress Chloe pursue friendship with the mice and rats," Chavin thought. Still, the young man was standing right there, with his face screwed up in a look of furious attention. So Chavin tried again. See, the perspective glass must not move once we have found the spot we seek. Leotrodos down in Pericol says that the new star is in Kosopi. Once we have set the eye of our glass on Kosopi, we must tighten the housing so that it does not move. Thus we can make measurements not just tonight, but other nights. And we most certainly must not lean on the perspective glass while we are making those measurements. But the sky is full of stars, said Toby. Why is it so important to measure this one? Chavin closed his eyes for a moment. Because Leotrodos says he has found a new star. A new star has not been seen in hundreds of years, perhaps even thousands, since the methods of the ancients are sometimes obscure and thus open to question. More importantly, it raises many doubts about the shape of the heavens. The boy's puzzled look told him all he needed to know. Because if the heavens are fixed, as the astrologers of the Trigonate so loudly tell us, yet there is a new star in the sky, where did it come from? But, Master, that doesn't make sense, Toby said, yawning, but a little more awake now. If the gods made all the spheres, couldn't the gods just make a new star? Chavin had to smile. You are doing better. That is a proper question. But a more important question is, why haven't they done it before now? For a moment, just a moment, he saw something ignite in the young man's eyes. Then caution or weariness, simply the habit of a lifetime, dulled the expression again. It seems like a lot of thinking about a star. Yes, it is, and one day that thinking may teach us exactly how the gods have made our world. And on that day, will we not be merely gods ourselves? Toby made the pass evil. What a thing to say! Sometimes you frighten me, Master Chavin. He shook his head. Just help me get the perspective glass fixed on Kosopi again. Then you can take yourself to bed. It was just as well he was now alone, Chavin thought, as he wrote down the last of the notations. Even Toby might have noticed the way his hands had begun shaking as the hour he was waiting for came nearer. It was powerfully strange, this feeling. He had always coveted knowledge, but this was more like a hunger, and it did not seem to be a healthful one. Each time he used the great mirror, he felt more reluctant to cover it up again. Was it simply lust for the wisdom that he gained, or some glamour of the spirit which gave that wisdom to him? Or was it something else entirely? Whatever might have caused the craving, he could barely force himself to take the time to drape his long box full of rare and costly lenses in its heavy covering, and only the sharp chill of the night air persuaded him to add even more delay, so that he could crank shut the door in the observatory roof, shutting out those intrusive, maddening stars. His need was especially sharp, because it had been so long, days and days, since the mirror had gifted him with anything but shadows and silence. How frustrating it had been all of tonight trying to concentrate on Kosopi, when it was the 3 red stars called the Horns of Zmeos, also called the Old Serpent, that had his deepest attention. When they appeared behind the shoulder of Perrin's great planet, as they would do tonight, he could consult the mirror again. When the observatory room and the perspective glass were both secured, he went in search of Chloe. Tonight, if the gods smiled, her work and his offering would not be ignored again. Chavin's need had grown so strong that he didn't notice how roughly he was handling Chloe until she gave him a swift but meaningful bite on the web of his thumb and forefinger as he put her out. He dropped her, cursing and sucking at the wound as she scampered away down the passage. But although his anger was swiftly replaced by shame for his carelessness toward his faithful mistress, even that shame was devoured by the need that was roaring up inside him. He sat before the mirror in a dark room that already seemed to be growing darker still, and began to sing. It was an old song in a language so dead that no one living could be certain they were pronouncing it correctly, but Chavin sang the words as his one-time master, Caspar Daielos, had taught them to him. Daielos, sometimes called the Warlock of Crace, had never owned a great mirror, although he had possessed broken shards of more than one, and had been able to do wonderful things with those shards. But mirror lore, as a discipline, was as much about remembering and passing that memory along for the generations to come as it was about the practical manipulation of the cosmos. Chavin often wondered how many wonderful, astounding things had been lost in the plague years. And so Daielos had taught all that he had learned to his apprentice, Chavin. Thus, on that day when Chavin had found this particular mirror, this astounding artifact, he had already known how to use it, even if he had not precisely understood every single step of the process. Now Chavin rubbed his head, troubled by an errant thought. His brow was starting to ache from staring into the mirror shadows, and wondering if something else was looking at the shadow mouse that lay on the shadow floor, and whether that something would finally come. Was he doomed to failure again tonight? He was distracted, that was the problem. But he could not help being puzzled by the fact that he suddenly couldn't remember where he had acquired the mirror that was before him now, leaning against the wall of his secret storeroom. At least it seemed sudden, this emptiness in his memory. He could recall without trouble where and when he had obtained each of the other draped glasses on the shelves, and their particular provenances as well, but for some reason he could not just at this moment remember how he had obtained the jewel in his collection, this great mirror. The incongruity was beginning to feel like an itch that would not be scratched, and it was growing worse. Even the powerful hunger he felt began to weaken a little as the puzzle took hold of him. Where did it come from, this powerful thing? I have had it how long? Just then something flared in the center of the looking glass, a great outwash of white light as though a hole had been torn through the night sky to release the radiance of the gods that lay behind everything. Chavin threw his hands up, dazzled. The light faded a little as the owl settled, folded its bright wings, and looked back at him with orange eyes, Chloe's sacrificial mouse in its great talons. All his other thoughts flew away then, as though the wings had enfolded him as well, or perhaps as though he had become the tiny thing clutched in that snowy claw, in the grip of a power so much greater than his own that it could seem a kind of honor to give up his life to it. He came up out of the long emptiness at last, and into the greater light. Music, beyond explaining, a kind of endless drone that was nevertheless full of complicated voices and melodies, still filled his ears, but was beginning to grow less. His nostrils also seemed still to breathe that ineffable scent, as powerful and heady sweet as attar of roses, although such roses never grew on bushes rooted in ordinary earth, in soil steeped in death and corruption. But it was no longer the only thing he could think about. It might have been, and might have only been with him a moment, that deepest bliss, or he might have been basking in those sensations for centuries, when the voice that was no voice spoke to him at last. A single thought that might have been, "I am here," or simply, "I am." Male, female, it was neither, it was both. The distinction was of no importance. He expressed his gratefulness that his offering had been received again, at last. What came back to him was a kind of knowing, the powerful calm of something that expected nothing less than to be adored and feared. But even in the midst of his joy at being allowed within the circle of this great light again, something tugged at his thoughts, a small but troubling something, just as shadows in his room of mirrors sometimes seemed to take odd shapes at the corner of his eye, but never at the center of his vision. Questions, he remembered, and for an instant he was almost himself. I have questions to ask. The roof-toppers, he announced, those small old ones who live in hiding. They speak of someone they call the Lord of the Peaks, who comes to them and gives them wisdom. Is that you? What came back to him was something almost like amusement. It was also a sensation of dismissal, of negation. So they do not speak of you, he persisted. It is not you who visits them with dire warnings? The shining thing, it looked nothing like an owl now, and although at this moment its shape was perfectly plain to him, he knew he would not afterward be able to explain it in words, nor even quite remember it. Took a long time to answer. He felt the absence in that silence almost as a death, so that when it did speak again, he was so grateful that he missed part of what it told him. Things had been awakened that would otherwise be sleeping, was all the sense that he could make of its wordless, fragmented thought. The shining thing told him that its works were subtle and not meant for him to understand. He sensed he was being chided now. There was more than a hint of discord in the all-surrounding music. Chavin was devastated and begged forgiveness, reminded the shining thing that he only wanted to serve it faithfully. But in the one piece of his secret self which remained to him, the small, sour note had allowed him to think a little more clearly. Was that truly his only wish? To serve this thing, this being, this force? When he had first touched it, or it had touched him, had they not almost seemed to have been equals, exchanging information? But what did it want to learn from me? What could I possibly have given to this power? He couldn't remember now any more than he could remember how the mirror, the portal to this painful bliss, had first come into his hands. The radiant presence made it clear that it would forgive him for his unseemly questioning, but in return he must perform a task. It was an important task, it seemed to say, perhaps even a sacred one. For a moment, but only a moment, he hesitated. A little of himself still hung back as though the mirror were a fine sieve, and not all that had been shaven could pass through it into the singing fire. That tiny remainder stood and watched, helpless as though in a nightmare, but it was not strong enough to change anything yet. What must I do? He asked. It told him, or rather, it put the knowledge into him, and just as it had chided, now it praised. That kindness was like honey and silvery music and the endless awesome light of the heavens. You are my good and faithful servant, it told him, and in the end you will have your reward, the thing you truly seek. The white light began to fade, retreating like a wave that had crested, and now ran backward down the sand to rejoin the sea. Within moments he was alone in a deep, secret room, lit only by the guttering flame of a black candle. Pounding on the kitchen floor brought Mistress Jennikin out in her nightdress and nightcap. She held the candle before her as though it were a magic talisman. Her gray hair, unbound for the night and thinning with age, hung in an untidy fringe over her shoulders. It is only me. I am sorry to rouse you at such an hour, but my need is great. Doctor? Oh, what is wrong? Is someone ill? Her eyes widened. Oh, Zoria, watch over us. There hasn't been another murder. No, rest easy. I must go on a journey, that is all, and I must leave immediately, before dawn. She held the candle a little closer to his face, scanning for signs of madness or fever, perhaps. What, the doctor, it's, yes, the middle of the night. To be more precise, it is 2 hours before dawn by my chain clock. I know that as well as anyone, and better than most. And I know at least as well as anyone else what I must do, don't you think? Of course, sir. Well, what do you want? I mean, get me bread and a little meat so that I can eat without stopping. But before you do that, rouse Harry and tell him I need my horse readied for a journey. No one else, though. I do not want everyone in the household watching me leave. But where are you going, sir? That is nothing you need to know, my good woman. I am going now to pack up what I need. I will also write a letter for you to take to Lord Ninor, the castellan. I hope to be gone only a day or two, but it might be more. If any of the royal family needs the services of a physician, I will tell Ninor how to find Brother Okros at the academy. You may send anyone else who comes in search of me and cannot wait to Okros as well. He rubbed his head, thinking. I will also need my heavy travel cloak. The weather will be wet, and there may even be snow. But, Doctor, what about the Queen and her baby? Curses, woman, he shouted. Do you think I do not know my own calling? She cowered back against the door frame, and Chavin was immediately sorry. I apologize, good Mistress Jennikin, but I have given thought to all these things already, and will put what is needed in the letter to Ninor. Do not worry for the Queen. She is fit, and there is a midwife with her day and night. He took a deep breath. Oh, please, take that candle back a little. You look like you intend setting me on fire. Sorry, sir. Now go and rouse Harry. He's slow as treacle in winter, and I must have that horse. She clearly wanted to ask him something else, but didn't dare. Chavin sighed. What is it? Will you be back for Orphan's Day? The butcher has promised me a fine pig. For a moment he almost shouted again. But this was the matter of her world, after all. This was what was important to her, and, in ordinary times, would have been to Chavin as well, who dearly loved roast pork. So what if these were not ordinary times? Perhaps there would be no more Orphan's Day feasts after this one. A shame to ruin it. I am as certain I will be back before Orphan's Day, and in fact before Wild Song Night, as anyone can be who knows the gods sometimes have ideas of their own. Do not fear for your pig, Mistress Jennikin. I am sure he will be splendid, and I will enjoy him greatly. She looked a little less frightened as he turned, as though despite the hour, life no longer seemed quite so dangerously topsy-turvy. He was glad that was true for one of them, anyway. The physician's manservant did his best to turn Chert away. The old man seemed distracted, guilty, as though he had been called away from the commission of some small but important crime and was in a hurry to get back to it. Taking a nap, Chert guessed, although it seemed early in the morning for such things. Late lie-in, then. He would not be chased off so easily. I don't care if he isn't seeing anyone. I have important business with him. Will you tell him that Chert of Funderling Town is here? If the physician was just busy and not at home to visitors, Chert thought, perhaps he could go around through the secret underground passage. Surely Chavin would not dare to ignore a summons to that door. But it would take him a very long time to manage going and then making his way back, and he bitterly resented the idea of losing so much of the day. Each hour last night spent in fruitless search for the boy had been more galling than the last. It was even more infuriating now, as though Flint were on some kind of wagon or ship that sped further away with each passing moment. The manservant, despite Chert's protests, was about to shut the door in his face when an old woman stuck her head under the tall old man's arm and peered out at the Thunderling. He had seen her before, just as he had seen the old man, although mostly from a distance, as Chavin led him through the observatory. He couldn't remember either of their names. "What do you want?" she asked, eyes narrowed. "I want to see your master. I know it isn't convenient. He may even have given orders not to be disturbed, but he knows me, and I'm in great need." She was still looking at him with mistrust. Like the old man, she had faint blue shadows under her eyes and a fidgety, distracted air. No one has had much sleep in this house either, Chert thought. After his own night stumping up and down Thunderling Town, and even through South March above ground, he felt like an itching skin stretched over a stale emptiness. Only fear for the lost boy was keeping him upright. "It can't be done," she said. "If you need physic, you must go to Brother Okros at the academy, or perhaps one of the barbers down in the town." "But—" He took a breath, pushed down the urge to shout at this obstinate pair. My son is missing. Chavin knows him, gave me some advice about him. He is a special boy. I thought Chavin might have some idea." The woman's face softened. Oh, the poor wee thing. Missing, is he? And you poor man, you must be heart sick." "I am, mistress." The manservant rolled his eyes and vanished back down the hallway. The woman stepped out into the courtyard, drying her hands on her apron, then looked around as though to make sure they were safe from prying eyes. "I shouldn't tell you, but my master's not here. He's had to go on a sudden journey. He left this morning before dawn." A sudden suspicion, fueled only by coincidence, made him ask, "Alone? Did he go alone?" She gave him a puzzled look, but it began to shade into resentment as she answered, "Yes, of course, alone. We saw him off. You surely don't think—" "No, mistress, or at least nothing ill. It's just that the lad knows your master and likes him, I think. He might have tagged along with him, as boys sometimes do." She shook her head. "There was no one about. He left an hour before the sun was up, but I had a lamp and I would have seen. He was in a terrible hurry, too, the doctor, although I shouldn't speak of his business to anyone. No offense to you." "None taken." But his heart was even heavier now. He had hoped at the very least that Chavin's keen wit might strike on some new idea. "I'm sure you have a great deal to do, mistress. I'll leave you. When he comes back, could you tell him that Chert of Thunderling Town wanted urgently to speak with him?" I will." Now she seemed to wish there was more she could do. "The gods send you luck. Oh, I hope you find your little lad. I'm sure you will." "Thank you. You're very kind." In his weariness, he almost slipped twice going up the wall. When he reached the top, he had to sit and gasp for some time until he had air enough to speak. "Hello! It is Chert of Thunderling Town!" He dared not shout too loud for fear of attracting attention below. It was the middle of the morning, and even this less traveled section of the castle near the graveyard was not entirely empty. "Her Majesty Queen Upsteeplebat very kindly came to meet me and my boy Flint," he called. "Do you remember me? Hello!" There was no reply, no stir of movement, although he called again and again. At last, so tired he was beginning to be concerned about the climb down, he rose to a crouch. Out of his pocket he took the small bundle wrapped in moleskin. He opened it and lifted the crystal up until it caught a flick of morning light and sparkled like a tiny star. "This is a present for the Queen. It is an Edri's egg, very fine, the best I have. I am looking for the boy Flint, and I would like your help. If you can hear me and will meet with me, I'll be back here tomorrow at the same time." He tried to think of some suitable closing salutation, but could summon nothing. He made a nest of the moleskin and set the crystal in it. What a beautiful, shining monster might hatch out of such a thing, he thought absently, but couldn't take even the smallest pleasure in the fancy. He picked his way with aching caution back down the wall, so heavy with despair that he was almost surprised that he did not sink deep into the ground when his feet finally touched it. And I think that may be our place to stop, because then there's a long section more until the end of the chapter. So, with that, and a tilting of the room, oh my God, we hit an iceberg! With that and various other thoughts, which I will impart to you in a moment, I'm going to wrap it up for today, because I still have to figure out how to post this thing online. And as all of you know, my struggles with Google Chrome and Facebook and the interactions thereof between the two of them are sometimes complicated and are always interesting in the Chinese sense of the word, as in, may you live in interesting times. So I still have to figure out how to do that before we leave the house. So I am, rather than read on for another 10 or 15 minutes to finish the chapter, we're going to stop at this point. But we're pretty close to what we usually do. So with that said, I say to those of you who, whenever you're listening to this, this is the 4th of July when I'm doing this, but that's not particularly important to the story being read. But as usual, I do want to say, whoever is streaming this, you're not joining me live, but you're joining me anyway, and I value that and enjoy that. And I'm very pleased to have been able to spend some more time with you, albeit this time pre-recorded. So that's all I really want to say. Thank you so much. Be well, take care of yourself and those near and dear to you, and even those a little further away from you who might need some help anyway. So with that, good night, peace. For those in America, in these shores, I say happy 4th of July to you. Don't blow up, don't get blown up, and don't blow up anybody else. Words to live by. Okay, thank you very much. Cheers, and farewell.